Okay, welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. Today our topic is Henry VIII in England, Reformation in England, and Thomas More. So these are complex topics. The first most important idea, Reformation in England happened in a totally different way than in the rest of Europe, than it is in France or in Germany. And it didn't happen at all in Spain and Italy. Now, in one word, usually it's all connected to Henry VIII and his divorce and the consequence of it. But in fact, it's much, much more complex. And it's not just the divorce issue. It was a popular movement also, in addition to the divorce issue. So let's get the story of his wives and divorce and try to determine how it is connected to the popular movement and the sentiment in England and how they came to the idea of separation from Rome and creating their own church. So the story begins basically in 1503, where the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Catherine, is married to a prince in England. But as a matter of fact, it was not Henry, it was his brother. So she was married to his brother, and they were children at that time. And then his brother died, and it appeared, although nobody knows for sure, that what they officially called their marriage wasn't consummated, which basically means they haven't slept together. So she apparently was still a virgin. And it was decided that they would marry her to Prince of Wales, which is Prince of Wales is somebody who is going to become a king, Henry, the future Henry VIII. She was 5 years older than Henry. And he absolutely didn't want that marriage at all. He was not interested, but nobody asked him. Henry VII, his father, basically insisted on it for political reasons because she was the daughter of the most powerful couple in Europe, and Spanish alliance was important for all these diplomatic games with France and the Pope. So they got married, and by 1516, which is 15 years later, actually 12 years later, there were 3 sons who were born, 3 boys, and they all died. And of course, childhood mortality was a pretty big issue at that time. In 1516, Mary was born. So Mary was raised as a Catholic. She would be a future Queen of England, and she would be known as the Bloody Mary. Although totally wrong, because she wasn't bloody at all, but that's her historical name. So 1516, Mary is born. After that, there's another son that is born, and he dies. So basically, all the sons that she gave birth to died, but Mary survived. Finally, after trying another 9 years, 1525, he sort of gave up. He was 35 at that time, and she was 40. And this is pretty much the end of her childbearing age. And he and she both got quite frustrated because he needed a son to continue the dynasty. So at this point, as a matter of fact, a little bit earlier, he takes as a mistress a young woman whose name was Mary Boylan. And they were aristocratic family, they were at the court. He takes a mistress, which was not unusual at that time because the French kings did it openly and without any remorse. But in England, it was a little bit not exactly right, but everybody had to live with it, and basically was afraid to say anything. Well, Henry very quickly got to know the sister of Mary, and her name was Anne Boleyn. She will actually wind up being the Queen of England. So Anne spent some time in France at the court, and she picked up French language and French manners and French customs, and Many other things were said about her French ways. She was very beautiful, very vivacious, very energetic. She had black hair, sort of very seducing, as they say, black eyes, and the manners and were quite spontaneous in her actions. Not British. She acted very much not like a British lady, but more like in France. So she very quickly captivated his attention, and from 1527 she becomes the lover of Henry. Now the thing is that Mary, her sister, never had. She was very modest, and she gave birth to a boy. But she never really claimed anything, never wanted anything. She was very timid and very obedient and very quiet. And her sister Anne was different. She was quite ambitious, energetic, flamboyant, sexy in today's words, and she had ambitions. She did want to marry Henry, and she kept on actually advising him that to get a divorce. Now the thing is that it made a lot of sense, because he needed a legitimate son. He already had a son, but he could never become king of England because he was a bastard. He was born out of marriage. So here comes the beginning of the attempts that lasted for several years to get the official permission to divorce. The permission to divorce could be given only by one man, and that's the Pope. Now, the Pope at that time is Clement, and as we heard in our story of the Siege of Rome, which is exactly 1527, the Pope has no power. The Pope is a prisoner of the Emperor, which is Charles V, and Charles V is the uncle of Catherine, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, just as much as Charles V is the son of Ferdinand and Isabella. So he cannot do that. He cannot offend an emperor who is in whose power he completely is. So he's not going to give the divorce. So the next few years is the diplomatic game between the Catholic Pope, the Catholic Queen, which is Catherine, and Henry, who is trying to get a divorce. And he tried very hard. He did all kinds of initiatives. He tried to prove that his marriage with Catherine was not legitimate from the very beginning, because she had already been married to his brother who died, and she was a widow. And of course, if she was a widow, she could remarry, but they actually did not remarry as a widow. They annulled, the preceding Pope, Julius, annulled their marriage to his brother. So Henry was asking now, if that marriage was annulled, how come his marriage couldn't be annulled as well? So this was quite complicated. In the end, 1530, all these diplomatic maneuvers end with denial. The Pope says no, the divorce will not be granted. The Cardinal who tried to arrange all that was Woolsley, and he tried and tried and tried, and then in the end he failed, and he died in 1529, and that's sort of a final no to the attempt to get a divorce. So what to do next? Now we go not just to Henry, but to the political landscape in England. There was, just like in Germany and just like in France, a very growing discontent against the Catholic Church as such, against the priests as such, and against the Pope as such, from a variety of quarters. First of all, it was because the Church had its own organization, which was called Convocation, and they had their own courts, and they levied their own taxes, the tenth. In other words, they had monasteries, they had property, they were a very powerful part of English life. And the parliament that consisted pretty much of landowners and businessmen and merchants, they they felt that the church is a competition. So there was a serious kind of an anti-church feeling in the parliament. Essentially, like everywhere else, the Pope gets our money. Why should we pay to the Pope? The same as in Germany among the higher classes and aristocracy. As for the masses, at this point, there was no particularly strong popular movement for any sort of reform of the church. However, what there was is like in Germany. There was resentment of the priests and their riches. So there was, of course, some abuse, there was some corruption, there were some offices for sale, there were some court decisions that were disputed. So the kind of a local discontent, similar kind as the German peasantry, but not as hard, not to a point of explosion as was the case in Germany. But there was a kind of a popular discontent that has not yet taken the form of a political movement as it did in Germany with Luther and his followers. So, back to the story of divorce. 1532, Henry begins slow campaign to dissociate England from the Pope, little by little, step by step. So 1532, there's an order to stop remittances of money to the Pope. This is big time. I mean, this is like an act of defiance to the Pope that you're not going to get our money anymore. And then there's a hint. If you give divorce, then we might. So he's not yet ready to break completely, but he's playing this game. 1532, the convocation, the highest church authority, is ready to break with the Pope and to keep its accounts for itself. Chancellor Thomas More, the famous author who we'll talk about later, he resigns in protest. He remains a faithful Catholic, and he does not want England to break with the Pope. 1533, no litigation, which means no court cases, will be set for the highest challenge, for the highest approval to Rome as well. What really pushes the issue to the fore is a situation in early 33, which is that Henry and Anne realize she's pregnant. And if she gives birth and they're not married, this is going to be a bastard, like with her sister. And he absolutely has to have, he's obsessed with having a son and having a successor. So this really pushes him over the edge, and they get married. In January 33, Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII get married. And in April, she has the happiest moment in her life. She's coronated. There's a coronation. She's officially Queen of England. And the convocation, the British authority, actually at that time was called English, the British is much later. Let's use the correct names. The English convocation approves the divorce, and that is when they have their coronation. However, the Pope, in July 33, pronounces the marriage null and void, and the child that would be born illegitimate. And basically, this is a declaration of war between the Pope and Henry. So, in response, Henry requires all the people of England to pledge allegiance to him as the head of the English Church. So, this is the appearance of what is now known as the Anglican Church. He proclaims himself to be the leader of the Anglican Church, and he requires of all the people to pledge allegiance to him and not to the Pope. So most people do, even though historians tell us that the popular sentiment was sort of skeptical, but they did understand, both the Parliament and the Convocation, that England does need a a male heir, and without it there will be chaos, like in the preceding century, with the constant struggle for power between the White Rose and the Red Rose and the civil wars. They learned their lesson. You've got to have a legitimate king who is recognized by succession. So in January 34, Elizabeth is born, the future great Elizabeth, who is going to reign for 60 years in the golden age of English Renaissance. But at this time, the Pope considers her illegitimate, and of course he did not get what he wanted, which is his son. He's got 2 daughters, but no son. The next problem arises, the final accord to this situation is that in 1535, 2 years after Elizabeth is born, he issues what is called a Act of Supremacy. So the Act of Supremacy is the document that basically officially says, passed by the Parliament, that the English Church is separate from Rome, that it is the head of the English Church is the king. And it's the same way now. The Queen is the head of the Anglican Church. It is a separate church, and it has nothing to do with Rome. Now, what's important for the church affairs to say is that the rituals were at first pretty much indistinguishable like that from the Catholic Church. It was pretty much a separation on the state level. It was not a popular movement like in Germany. And little by little, and especially later, when Edward would be king, it would become more Protestant, and there would be more of a Protestant element to it, and then they will have a social movement that would be truly Protestant, called the Puritans. But at this point, it was pretty much like a Catholic Church without the Pope. That was the key difference. But back to the story. Then Clement dies and there's a new Pope, Paul III. He actually goes a step further. He excommunicates Pope and calls all Christians to disobey him and to disregard his decrees and to actually rise and overthrow him. Now this was so radical that Charles V, the emperor, didn't even publish this. This was too much. This would be like a declaration of war, and that decree, this bull it was called, remained unfulfilled. The next year, 1536, Anne gives birth to a dead child, a boy, and he gets into depression. He kind of realizes his hopes of having a son are dashed one more time. And this is when he cools off to Anne and wants to get rid of her. And now he's openly falls in love with one of her maids, one of her girls in her entourage. They were called Fräulein in Germany, and they were called maiden, lady in waiting. And her name is Jane Seymour, and he falls in love with her, and he has to get rid of Anne, and then he does something really tragic for Anne. He accuses her of infidelity, and there's a court, and there were 5 men who were accused of having infidel relations with her. They all refuse. They all subjected to torture. They still refuse. She refuses to admit any of this. All of them are executed, and so is she. She's found guilty of infidelity, and she is executed. I think they chopped her head off, which basically gives way to Henry to get married to Jane Seymour. And they get married in 1536, and she does give birth to a boy, finally. But 12 days after the birth of the child, she dies, and he's very, very frustrated. He's of course stricken On the one hand, he had a child, he has a boy. On the other hand, the girl he loved dies. And he is going to live. He's going to reign too. He's going to be Edward the Seventh. So very soon he's going to marry again. He's going to marry 3 more times, and none of them will have children. So the only children he did get were these 3. It would be Mary the Catholic, Elizabeth the Protestant, and Edward the Protestant. And in the end, it would turn out to be that the Protestant one will be, Edward would be the most Protestant of all, and these are issues we will deal with at a later stage. Thank you.